in our language sometimes, right? There's things, there's clues in our Anishinaabe language, and a lot of indigenous languages basically across the world that gives you a clue, you know, to what this means, right? And what this is. And when we say, you know, weos, right? We're not basically saying like venison as a chef term or something. We're talking about, you know, a meat that comes from the land. And when we say weos, we could relate to that.
There are multiple entry points into this conversation around the prevalence of diabetes in Aboriginal populations, and traditional foods is just one entry point into this conversation.
People back home now, there are people who have diabetes and children who have type 2 diabetes, adult onset diabetes. They're like 12 years old, 10 years old, who are now on, you know, insulin, which just blows me away. All my life, I remember my grandparents, they would go hunting, and mainly my grandfather and all his sons. So he had 7 sons. They'd all go out to his camp. They would harvest over 100 geese, and then after that we would recruit my grandmother's friends and all the aunties, and then we would be sitting there plucking for 3 days. It would be a non-stop process. There would be feathers flying everywhere. Sure enough, we would eat geese every day, eat a goose every other day maybe. If we had other wild meat, that's what we would do. We would eat moose, goose, rabbit. It was just our way of life. We just never, there was never a time where I didn't remember having goose.
Colonialism and assimilation really impacted all spheres of life for Aboriginal people, for Indigenous people. The fact that people now suffer from illnesses such as diabetes is directly related to the impacts of colonialism, and then the fact that the traditional ways of knowing about the world that's around you and living in this world were completely disrupted.
We had a settlement in our community, which was the Hudson Bay Company. We had all these people that came on the boats that brought flour, that brought sugar, that brought lard, that brought all this stuff that we weren't accustomed to. And then just being in a settlement where we were given stuff for trade and stuff like that. And then that inactivity came about where we didn't go out in the land and we didn't go and work for our food. We didn't go and do all the stuff that we normally did because people were bringing it to us. They were giving us all this stuff to use to cook. You know, that's where diabetes came about. All the foods that came from sugar, from us not being active, you know, like we normally are. And that's the sad thing because it's preventable.
The approach to health research in the mainstream is very medical. They look at cause, they look at symptoms. Any type of research that the OFIFC does or supports, including research done in 29 communities with which we work, is grounded in USAI Research Framework, utility, self-voicing, access, and interrelationality. We look at everything holistically. And we knew, again, talking to elders, talking to people, that there is this wealth of knowledge on traditional foods. So instead of asking people embarrassing questions or counting people or asking about these symptoms, we thought that if people get together and talk about traditional foods and diabetes in this very kind of safe environment, they can feel more confident about this type of research that is very intrusive. But they can also feel they have a lot to contribute to the community.
Traditional to me means learning how to cook from what you get from the land. You know, we don't have electricity in the bush. We don't have fridges. We don't have freezers. They had to find ways to preserve the meat so it can last for so long. I grew up on that. I never learned how to do that because I was taken away by RCMP, and the priest put me in residential school, and I lost that way of life. Like I just learned from watching people, listening to people talk.
And I want to speak to you a little bit about an animal which is near and dear to my heart and is also part of where I come from. I've hunted this deer late last fall in December. Some people hunt for sport, I hunt for food. And we need a lot of meat in my family. I usually harvest about 7 to 9 deer. By Christmas, this is our real gift, and it's a great gift that I could offer my family and my family members. I never bring my meat to the butcher. I butcher it all myself. And I think you pay the best tribute when you don't rush things and think that you have to get it processed. There's enough processing out there that I think that we should, if we're going to kill the animal, we should take time to also honor it by cutting it and remembering it. This here, I'm going to maybe just fry with some peppers and some onions in a pan. And keep your senses alert because you're going to smell the forest.
One of the things that we were taught when we were very young by our grandparents is that we don't think of the preparation in cutting up the geese or cleaning the geese as disgusting or gross, for lack of a better word, because this is what we call, this is our sustenance, it's our food. This is what keeps us vital and healthy. But it's all part of keeping the tradition alive, and you just don't even think of it as a cultural thing because it's so normal for us. It's just an everyday thing, and it's like, it's just the norm.
It's natural to me. It's not something that I was taught to live. It was just like a way of living for me. That's what traditional food was to me. As soon as I could reach the countertop, like we would have little stools, my grandmother would put us to work right away. As soon as we could reach that counter, there would be like, okay, get in here. Time for you to learn.
People who suffer from any illness are asked sometimes very difficult questions about the illness, about their disability, and kind of feeling more and more like victims of the medical system. We thought that we need to come from a strength-based perspective.
Our people were really strong. Okay? Our people were really, really strong. They were really resilient, They were determined too, I think, our people, our grandmothers and our ancestors. They were determined to, and I think that's still here. Like, we still have determination. We still have that in us that we want to see that. We want to see that for our children, Mm-hmm. We still want to do that. I still want to introduce my grandchildren to fish. I still want to introduce them to moose and deer venison. And I have,
I am diabetic, and I found out in 2008 I was diabetic. I was 200 pounds back then, so I was wondering why I was always tired. So the doctor says, eat like the old way. And the weight goes on and on and on and on. You can't control it.
I remember my grandfather would leave in the morning, he would come back at night. He was always busy, and my grandmother was always busy getting the wood and, getting water, and we didn't have TV, we didn't have a radio. It was always constant moving, and that's where I believe diabetes came from, is that inactivity and all the sugar in foods nowadays.
Exercise will decrease your blood sugar and ultimately reduce your risk factors. I don't think they thought of it being exercise. It was just something that they had to do because they had to go and harvest the geese. They had to haul in their canoes to the camps. They had to carry all their supplies.
There's a lot of activity involved in traditional hunting, traditional foods, preparing traditional food, from when you start, there's a lot of activity, walking, hunting, cutting wood, carrying it back, and preparing. You burn that fat off. You know, you burn the sugar off. That's what, to me, that's what's missing these days.
Anytime you can get people together and you create a space where people learn from each other, this is indigenous research. When you create a safe space where people can tell stories, where people can connect the stories in many different circles, this is indigenous research. And really, whatever feels comfortable to people in the community, this is indigenous research.
It's hard to find people that cook like the old way, you know, the way it tastes, like you said, it tastes different. Because back then we didn't have open the oven, put it in there, you know, put in all these fancy things in it. We didn't have that. It was just plain, but it was awesome. It was really, really good. It didn't matter. Didn't have all these fancy little spices and stuff. It wasn't that. It's just that it tastes real.
Things that people instinctively know are good. Things that are not chemically treated. Foods that are not genetically modified. And most importantly, I think that traditional foods are foods that have this connection, the whole meaning behind the food as not just something that you eat and not just something that nourishes you physically, but something that nourishes you mentally, emotionally, spiritually as well.
When I talk about mind, body, and spirit, you know, there's a connection here, an instant, natural connection. So last year, I only got 3 deer. And what happened is I wounded 2 deer near the end, and I called off the hunt. And I felt really bad about what happened, you know. I was just not feeling comfortable in my ability to kill, harvest the deer anymore. So I just put a stop to it. And I actually went to a place that, you know, was kind of sacred to me, and I laid down some tobacco, and I asked, you know, the spirits, my father who passed away, and the elders for forgiveness for what I have done, you know. I was a bit hard on myself, I guess, but this is the way I think this needs to be treated with respect, you know, because this has fed our people here for generations. And I think, you know, if we don't do it justice and we don't give it the respect it deserves, you know, then we're not paying an honest tribute to ourselves and our ancestors.
There seems to be this disconnect, this gap in understanding between the positive role that traditional food consumption and preparation can play in addressing diabetes, and it's our responsibility to demonstrate that these conversations are happening and that they have been happening, and it's really about time that these voices are factored into those mainstream conversations, and that they meaningfully influence government decision making.
I think, you know, we've got to get back to this type of wild foods, because that's basically where the future of our health lies, right? And I think once we find ways of reconnecting back to our traditional foods, everything else follows suit, right? Better health and better for our children and moving on.
What time is supper?
Midnight.